Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the weekly Thrive in China Roundtable. I am on here today to talk about implementing internal controls within your China business. Again, something that, in my opinion, is fundamental to a strong foundation for your China organization. So how the Roundtable works, for those of you that are new to the Roundtable, is that I am here to teach you about concepts on how to systemize and scale your China operation. If you have questions, whether you're showing up live or whether you're watching this on replay, don't hesitate to reach out. You can either set up a one-to-one meeting or just email me with the questions that you might have. This is your time spent. It's going to be 60 minutes of your time spent watching this. So please do ask away, right? There's no question that is a dumb question when it comes to China. My goal will be to hopefully answer all the questions that you may have. From a technical perspective, we're using Zoom meetings. If you run into any difficulties, we are recording today's session. A recording link will be provided to everybody. But if you run into any difficulties during the live session, just log off, log back in. My name is Kristina Koehler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors, and I'm a leading expert on inbound investment into China, which means that my focus is 100% on foreign investors that are expanding into the Chinese market. I've got almost 18 years of on-the-ground experience in corporate services and corporate compliance in China. My brother, who is our managing director in Hong Kong, has over 25 years with corporate services and corporate compliance experience in Hong Kong. We cater to these two jurisdictions. We work with over 500 international companies. We have worked with over 500 international companies on their pre-investment strategy development in terms of creating business models, what would be the best business model, and how to scale up to achieve the results that have been set for the strategy. We implement those business models, and then we help these clients to grow and to scale to hit the targets that they have set earlier on. In the corporate services and corporate compliance realm in China, there have been tremendous changes over the last 17, 18 years, which is why we have created systemized processes and methodologies for several aspects of your business pertaining to administration. So whether it's creating your own China roadmap, whether it's protecting your trademarks, patents, copyrights, whether it's understanding how to incorporate your entity in China, whether it's understanding how to communicate and grow your business with your Chinese accountant, whether it's choosing the right people for your corporate management in China, and ultimately how to recruit and employ your first employees in China as well. All of those recordings are up on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to that and you'll get a listing of all of our recordings as well as our daily videos. If you haven't received a copy of our ebook, which I wrote, which is the 10 biggest mistakes companies make in China, you can just email me at Kristina@woodburnglobal.com. This is predominantly the 10 biggest mistakes I have made in my China career for the last 17, 18 years. It's definitely an interesting read. You'll always get a good laugh out of it. So I do highly recommend it. Today's topic is about implementing an internal control system for your China business. And I have separated this out into two categories. One is looking at your business and one is looking at the finances of your business. So let's get cracking. I've provided a whole series of tips on how to protect your business, right? Setting up and implementing these internal controls is ultimately to protect your business from potential fraud as well as potential corruption. So the first tip that I want to give is around your company chops. When you are establishing your business in China, you need to receive a set of company chops, which is made up of your company chop, your contract chop, your legal rep chop, your finance chop, your fapiao chop, your customs chop, etc. And these chops are engraved and are registered with the Public Security Bureau. Now, for many of you, you might not actually be on the ground in China. So the question is then who is going to control the chops? Who is going to use the chops? It's therefore really important that you understand how you're going to operate and then create this operational guideline. right? Now, why is this a risk? Well, fundamentally, the risks is the fact that it's not uncommon for personnel, as well as third parties, to misuse chops, particularly if they are feeling like they're going to eventually be terminated, okay? It could also very well be that they keep the chops as a bargaining chip in case of termination, in case of losing face, whatever it might be. So there are people who maybe initially don't have an intention of doing something malicious, but eventually, because the circumstances are changing, do want to do something malicious, and they use these chops as leverage. Now, what's important to understand is that with the variety of different chops, you have access to signing contracts, you have access to utilizing bank accounts, you have access to declaring your value-added tax every month, you have access to releasing goods customs, whether it's for inbound, outbound trade flow. You're using the chops to run the company, right? These are the chops that are used. I'll give you an example. We just had a situation in the Shanghai lockdown where office buildings are shut down, where the Customs Bureau said, we will not release the goods unless we get a piece of paper with the chop, which was not in the hand of anybody else. And if you don't give us the chop by a certain deadline, then you're going to have to start they're going to start overcharging for the day rate for the use of the warehouse space at the Customs Bureau. Disaster, right? What are you going to do, right? So it is important to completely understand who's got access to the chops, who's using the chops, are they willing to use it? And are you going to have approval processes in place? So in this regard, just regarding the chops, right? It is important as part of your foundation to have an operational guideline on the use of these chops, whether it's employees that are going to use them, whether it's third parties like law firms, accounting firms, corporate service providers that are going to use them. So I've set up a couple of control methods, and it's up to you how you operate in terms of how you want to implement this. But one control method is dividing responsibility of the chops among key personnel. For example, the company chop is held by a lawyer, finance chop is held by the corporate service provider, accountant, the VAT chop is also held by them, the customs chop maybe is held by your supply chain manager, contract chop would also be held by your lawyer, and the legal rep chop should be kept by the legal rep himself. So you're dividing the chops into different people, but you've got to make sure you know who is holding the chops and how they're being used, all right? So in this regard, you want to create additional security measures by creating a logbook for each individual that is using specific chops that you can then track where the chops have been used, okay? In addition, you might want to have a hierarchical control system where, for example, you have a logbook, so the person is tracking how they're using it, but that person also needs to get approval from a senior manager to be able to use it and for what reason. There'll be email documentation, written documentation allowing for this approval. So it's two things. One is having a senior manager approve the use of the chop. And number two, track the use of that chop by date, usage, documents, and who. Okay. Now, I do want to say this is a lot of work. Okay, I get it. But like this, you're sleeping at night peacefully, knowing that nobody is maliciously using the chops to harm your organization. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you want to stay in China, you cannot afford to go through an obstacle like this, where somebody is maliciously using something, and you have to go through the trouble of taking them to court, of suing them, of getting a lawyer, and paying more money to defend this, instead of just from day one creating an internal guideline on how these chops are being used. And if somebody misuses it once, they're fired, because that's a breach of contract. Right? Makes your life so much easier. So do think about implementing this. Tip 2 is internal control of the business. And there are a variety of different I want you to look at in terms of creating operational guidelines. The first is in sales billing, and collection of funds. Now, this is generally the three where a company in China is most vulnerable to fraud and corruption, predominantly because it involves the transfer of money, it involves the transfer of goods. Could also be the transfer of services. So the internal control system has to be set up so that everybody that is in these three divisions is fully aware and there's transparency around how they can transact, how they can negotiate, right? And it has to be a rigid internal guideline. So just to give you some examples of where things again might go weird. Price ranges for different products should be firmly set. For some companies, each product might have a set price, while for others, there's room for negotiation with each individual client. But you have to set this up in stone. Businesses should establish firm ranges for which employees can sell a given product, whether it's a certain range for all sales or different ranges based on the quantity sold, etc. You do want to give certain flexibility to your employees, right? You don't want to get an email every single day. Hey, boss, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? You're just not going to get anywhere, right? So there has to be some flexibility and freedom around, but it should be set within the guideline. Having price ranges set in stone mitigates the risk of corruption in the sales process, such as when an employee offers a client a lower price for a product in return for a personal side payment or other favor. For example, a company may set the rule that senior managers must first approve any sale outside of a standard price range. So if your price range is between 100 and 600, if you're selling it at 50 or you're selling it at 650, approval is required. And obviously, if every department is aware of this, i.e. sales is aware of it, marketing is aware of it, supply chain is aware of it, and finance is aware of it, then they can become the whistleblowers and say, hey, boss, something is not, I'm using the word boss because I've got quite a few clients whose staff call them boss. Hey, boss, I've seen this transaction where it's under 50. Did they get approval from you? I haven't seen it. And that's the first sign where warning has to be issued, right? In addition to that, companies need to put in place different credit limits for clients based on considerations like the size of the client, the length of the relationship with the client, to avoid selling to an entity that will not be able to pay for the product. You may even want to go through a due diligence process, i.e. a background check of clients to verify that they can pay. Of course, this is all dependent on your payment terms. If your payment terms are very strict and rigid to say, we do not deliver product until you give us 100% payment, no problem, right? You're negotiating a fee, they accept, you get 100% payment, then you deliver the goods. But if you're having credit limits with your clients because of the length of your relationship, the loyalty you've had with them, this has to be put in a guideline. Remember, turnover of staff in China is high. So also when salespeople leave and new salespeople come in, having this operational guideline is fantastic for them to learn the business and understand what the rules and regulations are in terms of what they can and cannot do, okay? It's not just an employee handbook about the administrative side of the business. It's actually, how are they going to negotiate? How are they going to sell, right? So that in the best interest of them. It's also important to have an ERP system, and you don't need an expensive one, where employees, when they complete a sale, or even when they're in the process of negotiating a sale, the sales order data, the inventory, the shipping, invoicing processes are all included. So there you have the operational guideline, but then you have an ERP system that is tracking each order that is coming in and going out. All right. And remember, from a finance perspective, that with every transaction, the paperwork has to be there. If the paperwork is not there, it's also a red sign for you. So it's good in your operational guideline to highlight that the minimum paperwork that's required is FATCA, invoice, bill of lading, shipping documents, etc. Okay, because ultimately the finance team will be, in theory, the red flaggers, where they say, hey, we don't have these documents. Where are these documents? Or the documents, the information on the documents is not matching. Why are they not matching? Right? This all has to be raised. Now, we've just touched on sales, billing, and receiving accounts receivables, but then you also have to look at purchasing. Okay, so there are a lot of companies out there that are producing in China through third parties and then selling as well into China. So it's all domestic trade flow. And when you're but even if you're just exporting from China, this would be critical for you. So purchasing in China means that you're purchasing raw materials or you're purchasing finished goods for export or for domestic sale. And again, similar to the selling side, companies need to put in place a standard price range for purchasing, right? If you have a cup and you say that the average price of this cup on the Chinese market to manufacture is 10 RMB, and actually you are paying, I don't know, 25 RMB, that's a red flag, right? Why is there this 15 RMB price differential when the market average is 10, right? Is it because employees are pocketing funds? Is it because employees are getting kickbacks? Or is it simply because you're overlooking and not comparing other providers to understand the marketplace and what the average price is, right? So again, it's important, you can have in your operational guideline that the purchasing department needs to, I don't know, review 5 different proposals from 5 different factories to truly understand what the price is to produce a cup like this. We're not looking at quality yet. We're just looking at price. Of course, then quality plays a big issue as well, right? But again, this needs to be in the operational guideline. All right. Then obviously you need to make sure that in order to prevent fraud, you have multiple people, because purchasing really is where most of the fraud occurs, is you have multiple people overlooking and controlling what is going on, what is being negotiated, and that there's a hierarchy of approval processes. All right. It's sometimes even good to rotate staff on certain projects to avoid fraud and corruption. Okay. But of course, you always have to make the job also enticing. So I get that. Now, the next part we're going to look at in terms of the business is the human resource side. So for SMEs operating in China, particularly with those that have overseas headquarters and don't necessarily have foreign people on the ground supervising, internal HR goals are second, and this is where having an employee handbook is critical. The employee handbook is highlighting not just working hours and various leaves for death, maternity, and whatnot, but it also has 50% of that employee handbook should be around in case of a breach of contract, in case of a breach of trust, right? In case of multiple mistakes that the employee has been doing. And this guideline in your employee handbook that says, all right, for these variety of different mistakes or breaches, we're going to follow this category A warning sign. If it falls under B, we're going to do this. If it falls under C, which is the worst category, you have the ability to terminate straight away. Okay. Now, the issue with a lot of small startups in China, and even as those companies are scaling up, is that maybe you don't have a lot of people. Maybe you're only managing 1 initially. Maybe you're managing 4. Maybe you're managing 5. And you simply don't want to rock the boat. Well, my suggestion from my own experience is rock the boat. Get rid of the bad eggs. You cannot systemize your business and scale it up if you don't get rid of the bad eggs that are within your organization. So make sure you have ease so that you can terminate the underperforming employees so that you have the ability to scale at the speed that you want to scale at. Now, what's important when you're recruiting for employees is making sure that you go through a proper screening process, do a multi-stage interview process. Right now, I'm doing a recruitment for a finance person. We're in the 3rd stage of interviews, of discussions, and then there will be a final assessment to understand the skill set of the individual, as well as their analytical abilities. CV fraud is quite common in China. more so than in the West, I believe. So there are people that fake or exaggerate university degrees or work experiences. So it is important to work with reliable recruitment platforms. If you work with headhunters, it should be part of the agreement that they do a background check to verify all of the content that is within the resume. Labor contract management is also very, very important because you have options in China of having term contracts and open-ended contracts. If you have fixed term contracts, you've got to control this. When's the start date? When's the end date? Right? Not that you oversurpass it. The reason why I say all of this is because if you don't have the right contracts in place, the employees can ask for double salaries without you even realizing it. So it is important to make sure that the start date, end date is valid, that you're following up on this, and that you have the appropriate clauses in these employment contracts as well in terms of confidentiality, non-competition, etc. Ultimately, when you are analyzing the internal controls within your business in China, you've got to identify your core needs and risks. And it will all come down to what the functions are for your China company. So, you might just be a sales company. You don't have suppliers in China. You maybe have only one supplier that is your head office back home. So you won't need an internal control system for purchasing. Look at your core needs, risks, and identify what you actually need for your organization. Tip 3 is around the internal control for your finance division. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where problems arise and in what areas do problems arise in. Okay, so the first one, particularly if you're trading in goods, is inventory management. Okay, the problem is ultimately that there's a mismatch of records between your own internal inventory system and that of the warehouse management system, i.e. from the logistics provider. The only way to fix this and to have an easy mind is just smart. My biggest recommendation running a corporate services firm and doing this for my clients is to always do a spot check around the 30th, 31st of December to make sure that at least by the end of the fiscal year, you have matching records, okay? And if your inventory flow in and out is quite extensive, you may also then want to do an additional 1 to 2 spot checks throughout the year, okay? Just to make sure that it's not a hell of a lot of work in December, but that it's spread out through the year to really track that your financials are looking at the true status of your organization. In addition to when doing your spot checks, depending on the types of products that you are trading, it's always good to check the quality. Is anything broken? Is anything not broken? And then also to look at expiry dates, if applicable, like food and beverage, to see if anything needs to be thrown out or destroyed. The next is Fapiao management. Now, I did a roundtable event 2 weeks ago, or maybe a bit longer, on Fapiao, what Fapiaos are and how they are used. Problems in terms of actual finances can be input Fapiaos. These are Fapiaos from suppliers, not just manufacturing suppliers, but your landlord or the lease of your office or your corporate services firm or whomever, third parties. And maybe they haven't given you their Fapiao. Maybe they've put an incorrect amount on the Fapiao. It is so important to check and have somebody involved in following up to get Fapiaos from your suppliers and getting them on time. Making sure that the information on these Fapiaos is also correct, because there's nothing worse than dealing with an incorrect Fapiao. Output Fapiaos are the Fapiaos that you are going to issue when you sell in China, a service or a product. And if your finance team is not on top of this, or your sales team is not on top of this, it can sometimes get super confusing, where your finance team suddenly is issuing 2 Fapiaos, 2 sets of Fapiaos for the same transaction, because there's inconsistency between parts. Or, for example, undetected sales receivables with Fapiao issued is also another way, right, that you can get confused and have inconsistencies. So it's important always to check this. Now, more than just having an operational guideline, and I did say to you earlier, in terms of the actual business, every branch needs to have a set of documents, right? Invoice, FAPIAO, bill of lading, shipping documents, whatever it might be. But it's also very, very important that internally the teams are communicating with each other in terms of the transactions that are happening, which means merchandisers, finance should be communicating with supply chain. I don't, it depends on how you divide your teams, in order to have transparency over the transactions that are occurring. And then there can always be reminders, right? The finance team is putting all the information together so you have a good, clean, transparent set of accounts. But they can't do that if they don't get information from those departments. So communication is vital in this area, more so, in my opinion, than actually having the operational guideline. The operational guideline should be a basic. Communication is expense claims. Now, expense claims can be extremely labor intensive. Paperwork is heavy because you have to get all of these original FAPIAOs, and you have your finance person going through each one by one. Now, the issue here is that if you want to have a solid foundation and you want to be really rigid and strict, your finance person will be going through each FAPIAO given from your employee, tracking that it's all correct and has been approved by your superior. And most importantly, that the FAPIAOs are valid and not faked, all right? The issue is that when you don't have a valid operational guideline on expenses, employees will cheat you, okay? And there's a lot of things that can happen when they cheat you in this. One, it could mean that you have higher tax liabilities. It could mean that you actually have employees that are don't have the right vision for scaling up your organization because they're cheating you. And you're losing control of your budget, right? So it is really, 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 really important that you put controls in place in regards to expense claims. Now, these are all the different types of schemes that employees have actually done, still do, because nobody is supervising them in terms of their expenses, because it is labor intensive. But once one employee starts, doesn't mean that the others won't follow, okay? So firstly, what can you do in terms of implementing an internal control? First is clearly define the budgets that each staff member has. Maybe some staff member have no possibility to do expenses. It's important to set a budget, right? And create company policies around allowances for travel, allowances for meals with clients, etc. Okay? And you've got to communicate this in writing and very, very clearly. Then you have to have an organizational structure that is authorizing the expenses of each of the employees. So is it the team leader that is approving this? Is it the team leader's leader that is approving this? Who is actually this approval process? Okay. But the idea is to create an expense claim. So having a template in place that the employees just fill in, having a signature that is signed off by the employee, but then also signed off by the team leader. Then you need to collect all of the original documents and the cover page, which is the summary of all expenses. You want your finance person to really audit this, especially in the beginning of an employment of a new employee. And then you go through the process of reimbursing them, right? Going through the accounts payable and paying them. So this is actually a system that you can implement. That is to you how rigid you are in each of these steps. But you do need somebody to audit this often enough that it keeps your employees on their toes. Now, an action plan for anybody that is watching today's roundtable is create operational guidelines, create standard operating procedures, create internal guidelines to make sure that there is transparency and clarity amongst all of your employees and yourself in terms of processes, in terms of thresholds that the employees have, and making sure that every so often you audit the company to make sure that these guidelines are being followed by everyone. It's completely up to you on how rigid and strict you are. Of course, you you have to have room of certain flexibility, otherwise you can't succeed in China. But what you want to avoid is people misusing you, misusing your kindness, misusing the fact that you're lazy to check on your own organization. All right. Make sure you are following up on this critical foundation. And again, if you're looking to systemize your business, automate it, to scale it in China, you've got it. So a question for our roundtable, something for food for thought, really, is one, if you have a business in China, have you created your standard operating guidelines? If yes, I would love to know how successful they've been. Have they been successful? Have you had to pivot and change them, reword them throughout the growth of your organization in China? My assumption would be yes, you would have, but definitely think about doing it. Now, I just want to highlight that in last week's session, we talked about how to avoid a tax audit. You can only avoid tax audits if you create standard operating guidelines. And my experience having gone through a tax audit is I didn't even create a basic standard operating guideline, which the tax office asked me to do. So it was great from that perspective, having that push from somebody to actually force me to do a generalistic operational guideline on the whole business. But do create, but then also create management directives, create company CHOP directives, create then directives for the various departments within your organization. Now, I hope this presentation has been useful to you. How you can work with me is for a variety of different things that you might be doing in China. We help companies to incorporate and can advise them on the pre-investment stage. We offer incorporation services. And in fact, starting today, we've got a LinkedIn challenge on creating your China 2022 blueprint, all about understanding how to set up your business in China. We can appoint supervisor, which would be me. We can appoint finance managers, which would be my finance team, people within my finance team. We can also appoint as myself a non-executive director, which is more of a strategic role within your organization concerning your China ventures. We also offer tax advisory and outsourcing solutions for accounting, tax, payroll, and annual corporate compliance procedures. So I want to thank you all for joining our Thrive in China Roundtable. Again, just a reminder, these roundtables are totally free to join, so schedule them at any time in your diary. It's one registration, and you can attend all roundtables that we will have live till the year's end. And the next webinars that are up and coming, a very big one that everyone loves to hear about is developing profit repatriation strategies. We're going to be talking about how to work with your Chinese accountant, how to write a business plan, 6 ways to do business in China without an office or an entity on the ground, how to vet your business partners, and how to register your trademark in China. So if any of these are of interest, please don't hesitate to join. We look forward to seeing you there. Have a great afternoon. Take care and goodbye.